I was raised in a devout Catholic family and found myself gravitating away from faith at quite a young age. I was a very skeptical and generally anxious kid. At 12, I had a profound moment while driving home in the car with my mum, looking out the window at the lights of my suburb, feeling the dark, cool night air rushing on my face. Something so mundane and simple, and yet I was suddenly so overwhelmed with extraordinary peace and joy and a connection to all things I can't accurately convey in words. After arriving home, I ran to my room and cried, and in my diary wrote, "I feel like standing on top of the Eiffel Tower and saying, 'I love you' to the whole world." A little bit dramatic, but we can work with it. The moment lasted for maybe a minute, but it left an immense impression on me. For months afterwards, I was a lot less anxious, a lot more trusting, and generally just more at peace. A religious person might hear this story and nod and say, well, that aligns with my beliefs, and I might consider that a connection to divinity. But for me, I didn't and don't have any religious faith. At the same time, while this experience unsettled me in its magnitude, it isn't, according to the traditional models of legitimacy, a mystical experience. So, where do I place this experience? I'm still not sure. In hindsight, it was probably a spontaneous, prepubescent hormonal flush. It might have been a rush of all the happy chemicals resulting from sparkling lights and cool air. I don't have an answer. What does matter is that 18 years later, I'm still curious, going down the rabbit hole of wanting to find out what is an authentic, secular, mystical experience. I'm a PhD candidate in philosophy at the University of Tasmania. My research interests fall firmly in philosophy of religion and atheism studies, and I'm really fascinated with the juicy, uncharted territory between belief and non-belief. Traditionally, the experiences of those who believe and those who do not have been understood to be exclusive, different worlds. And yet, with a show of hands, who has witnessed a religious ceremony of a faith you don't believe in, yet still been moved? We're all human, sharing this earth and with similar brains and experiences. The population of people who identify as atheists, agnostics, and nones is steadily increasing. About a third of Australians indicated either no religion or a secular belief, such as atheism, humanism, or agnosticism, on the 2016 census. The number of people indicating no religion has increased by almost 50% just from 2011 to 2016. And with it, the question arises of how almost 30% of Australians make meaning in a world believed to be entirely material, a world that contains no larger cosmic system. I never quite moved past the experience of my 12-year-old self, and so perhaps unsurprisingly, my research is in philosophy of religion, and my PhD investigates whether secular, or non-religious, mystical experiences are real. Traditionally, mystical experiences have been considered to only be accessible to those with religious faith. The experience was considered to be a communication with divinity, and so required that there be a religious being, like God, for example, with which to make contact. Philosophers who embraced this model of mystical experiences accepted a kind of religious pluralism, the controversial view that all religions are legitimate expressions of a single, complex, true reality. However, my research indicates that religious belief in a deity is not essential for a mystical experience to occur, and explores the profound, often life-changing mystical experiences had by those without religious belief. So, where did this assumption that belief is necessary for mysticism come from? In the early 1900s, there was a sudden surge in interest in spiritualism, ghosts, and mediumship. This mystical movement arose out of the intellectual challenges presented by the increasing authority of science and the question of what the purpose of religion was if we couldn't rely on it as a source of ultimate truth. Mysticism fell into this broad basket of occult interests and caught the attention of the Harvard psychologist William James. James was not religious and a pragmatist to his core, meaning he wasn't as interested with establishing the truth of things as investigating the practical impacts that holding certain beliefs had on people's behavior. He himself had a life-changing moment at the top of the Adirondack Mountains in upstate New York, which he wrote about to his sister, saying that this most memorable of his memorable experiences was had a moment at midnight when the clear night, warmly burning fire, and streaming moonlight made it seem that the gods of all the nature mythologies were holding an indescribable meeting in my breast with the gods of the inner life. He was moved to lecture, publish, and relentlessly investigate this phenomenon until his death 12 years later. However, James refused to concede that this was a communication with an objectively real divinity. Instead, he concluded that it was possible to have a purely psychological conception of something greater than yourself, and that that was sufficient to produce an authentic mystical experience. Unfortunately, this minimalist psychological understanding of God has mostly been lost, and instead James has been misunderstood to claim that mysticism can't exist without a real divinity, even though James himself was not religious. In reality, James paved the way for legitimizing a secular mystical experience. So, if it is possible for a mystical experience to be a secular psychological experience, what would produce them? The works of several writers and poets are referred to as mystical. For example, Walt Whitman, Henry David Thoreau, and a raft of German Protestant writers from the same period that William James was doing his work in psychology. The common thread between all these works is that they are about nature, specifically the relationship between humans and their environment. These written works are usually deeply personal, in which the author transcends their mundane human concerns for a spontaneous moment of deep, often overwhelming, raw connection to the earth. Referring to such moments as epiphanies, the German writer Musil describes the experiences of his protagonist Taurus as lying in the summer grass, staring up at the sky, when suddenly he noticed. He felt as if it were the first time it had happened, how high the sky actually was. He felt a kind of sense of alarm. Right above him, an unutterably deep little blue hole was shining between the clouds. The further he went into it, the more the shining blue background receded, although it seemed as if you ought to be able to grasp it and hold it fast with your gaze. The desire to do so grew intense to the point of torment. It was as if his vision, strained to the utmost, was shooting looks like arrows between the clouds, and as if, however far it set its aim, they always fell a little short. Transient, passively received, impossible to accurately convey in words. The sense that one has moved from their normal, everyday perception of the world into something that is somehow more raw, more real. These, according to William James, are the 4 marks of a mystical experience, and perfectly summarizes what happened here with Taurus. Critically, there is no mention of the presence of a deity. But there's something else to this experience. In his alarm and wonder, staring up at that unutterably deep little blue hole of the sky, Taurus spontaneously grasped infinity. Infinity in philosophy means the same thing that it does anywhere else, the concept of something that is unlimited, endless, and without bound. The philosopher Immanuel Kant had a lot to say about infinity, and Kant, very famously, really could not. He never once left the boundaries of his hometown, preferring to sit inside, think about philosophy, and write. But doing so earned him the reputation as one of the most influential Enlightenment philosophers of all time. One of Kant's major contributions to philosophy was his theory of aesthetics, the branch of philosophy which deals with questions of beauty and taste. In addition to writing extensively on what constitutes the beautiful, Kant also came up with a second, really unusual theory. Have you ever thought about the power of a natural disaster and felt a shiver run down your spine? Ever seen footage of the immense strength of a volcano erupting and lava exploding from the core of the planet and felt dwarfed? The raw, crushing force of bushfires, cyclones, earthquakes, tsunamis. These are all things familiar to us here in Australia, and increasingly so. Kant called this an experience of the sublime, specifically the dynamic sublime. In a similar way, if we look up at the stars or at a never-ending mountain range stretching off into the horizon, or try to reach up and grasp the tiny blue hole of an infinite sky, we're experiencing the mathematical sublime. In both instances, we look at the world around us and we realize that our senses are not sufficient to fully witness the power or the magnitude of nature. As humans, we are small and fragile and transient in the face of these powers. And this is what Taurus experienced, lying in the grass, staring up at the sky. But even though Taurus realized that his eyes would never be able to see to the end of infinity, he could still grasp the concept. You and I can understand what infinity means, even if it is physically impossible that we will ever directly witness it. And for Kant, the fact that humans can grasp concepts beyond the limitations of their physical senses was evidence that humans are superior to everything that exists in nature. Our capacity to reason makes us dominant. This attitude was particularly strong during the Enlightenment period, but look around. The idea that humans are in hierarchy to nature, a hierarchy in which we are dominant, still stands today and informs much of how we use our earth and all the life on it for our own benefit. We use this to justify our taking and our taking and our taking. I quite like Kant's theory of the sublime. I think the emotions it describes, that sense of wonder and awe that is both breathtaking and terrifying, is accurate. What I don't like is the conclusion he reached about what our experience of the sublime means about our place in the world. Coming back to mysticism, we already know that a religious mystical experience is a moment of communication between a person and an abstract, unconscious being with which they have a faith relationship. This is really interesting because most of our relationships are with conscious material beings. Even if it's a dog, I can point and say, that's my dog. She takes up space on my floor, and even though she's not allowed, sometimes in my bed. I talk to her and she woofs back at me. That's a relationship. But with divinity, these markers of physical space and normal consciousness aren't present. So how could a non-believer, a person for whom physical space and normal consciousness is the only kind there is, have a relationship with something that isn't those things? Nature uniquely straddles both worlds. Nature is both entirely material and physical, and yet is an abstract concept. We use the word nature to encapsulate an infinite amount of objects. Every drop of water, leaf, tree, stone, cliff face, mountain range, down to the neutrino, a tiny subatomic particle, which right now are shooting in the trillions through every person in this room. Nature is not conscious, but it is alive. It moves and breathes and grows and dies and follows rules that scientists work every day to try to understand. I'm not talking about gods or aliens. I'm talking about something so mundane and yet so magical when I say, we aren't alone in this world. A person having a secular mystical experience suddenly grasps on a deep embodied level that they are in relationship with an abstract, unconscious being. This is an entirely psychological experience, but as the philosophical kingpin of mysticism, William James, would quickly point out, that's okay. Critically, this relationship is very different to the dominant hierarchy established by Kant with his theory of the sublime. This mystical relationship between humans and our earth is both equal and indivisible. We are inside it, and it is inside us. And it's easy to see how what is often a fleeting moment can be life-changing. Mystical experiences are described as having this wonderful Alice in Wonderland effect, where people are attached to infinity and so feel expanded beyond their normal boundaries. At the same time, this embodied awareness of the never-ending makes them profoundly mindful of the fragile, transient little spark that is our existence. Awe-inspiring and terrifying. Let me close with 3 questions. How would your life be different after having a secular mystical experience? Would the way you view and value our earth change? And will you, from today, take the time to nurture your relationship with nature? Thank you.